Hello and welcome to episode 146 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike in Modern. This is an all-Modern episode, I think.
They all are these days.
They really are, yeah.
I might be talking about a Pioneer PTQ.
There was a ban in Historic, and I think this is the first and last time we talk about that.
I can't believe we really should talk about this briefly.
Yeah, maybe we can touch on it on the breakdown. I'm Stanislav. I'm in Chicago. With me on the line from Denver, Colorado. One and only Shane Beeps.
Sounds like you want to go fast, Dan, but I want to go slow. I want to take it slow. I want to talk about my Thanksgiving in October I just had. I had mashed potatoes. I had dressing, not stuffing. What else did I have? And I had a lot of wine. I also had some salmon, but I did not have turkey because, I don't eat the turkey stuff. But that was my day. It was delicious. My mother-in-law just audibled to Thanksgiving. It was fun.
It's that Thanksgiving creep we've been hearing about in media lately.
Sometimes you just really get hyped for Thanksgiving food.
Yeah, sure.
Also, that's the Godfather from the historic Ernest Hemingway district, Dave Harbarger.
Yeah, I went to an apple orchard today.
Oh, my man's fallen.
Yeah, I'm doing fall things. I wore a vest. It's vest season. Wow. Looking like Han Solo out there. You know how we do.
Did you have Uggs?
I know. I didn't put on any boots or anything. No, but yeah, I did. That's what we did today. We had a nice drive to an apple. Yeah, all seasons orchard, Chicago, Woodstock, Illinois.
Where's the closest one to Chicago? Like 2.5 hours?
No, it's only an hour. 45 minutes. There's a whole burgeoning industry of fall stuff around Chicago, as Stan probably is aware of. We got some apples. Not many apples this year. I got to tell you, we were in the orchard. It's not that late in the season. Not a lot of apples left.
Man, I'm loving this food talk. Let's just make it an all food podcast like you want, Dave.
I wanted to talk about supply chain issues, especially Apple supply chain issues, if you don't mind.
So tired of supply chains. Team Supply Chain. That's our testing team for Vegas. Woodstock, Illinois is a nice town, though. Very cute and quaint.
It was a nice drive.
On this week's episode, we're on the road again. Las Vegas, almost exactly a month away. And we've been working on 3 more decks that are all but certain to make an appearance in the upcoming Modern Paper Tournament happening in Las Vegas in November.
I thought these were our brews. These were our hot brews. These are legit decks? I made this deck up.
Mine's kind of a brew.
Yeah, Shane had the brilliant idea of pairing Colossal Hammer and Sigarda's Aid with a bunch of 0 and 1 mana creatures.
And did you know that Urza's Saga becomes like a free tutor for your Colossus Hammer? I mean, no one's put this together yet, but I'm here. I'm here for it.
This is good. This is why people support us on Patreon. It's so that we have the time to quit our jobs and make cutting-edge new decks. Today we're talking about blue-white control. We're talking about Hammertime. And we're talking about Jund Saga. Mm-hmm. This ain't your grandparents' Jund deck.
But those last 2 are kind of our grandparents' decks. Or at least, I think I'm a Magic grandpa now. That's definitely our decks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We'll also kick off the show with a breakdown of some recent MTGO PTQs. And I guess we're going to audible into a little bit of ban talk. To be honest, I'm not sure what these PTQs are queuing for. Because I thought organized play is basically on the outs, but we'll find out eventually. Before all that, though, let's housekeep. Shout out to the newest patrons to join the Dive Down Nation: Chris B, Jason K, and Jason RK.
Wow. The Jasons showed up after Jason's special episode last week. Kilgore Jason brought 2 other Jason brothers.
They're like, all I got to do is be named Jason. I get my own episode. Perfect.
Did anybody check the voicemail box this week? Did we get any voicemails?
We did not receive any.
Okay. Well, people, call us if you want to talk.
Yeah, head on over into the pod inbox. The link will be in the show notes. It's a way for you to communicate to us via audio. If you have questions, feedback, anything.
You don't even need to go in the show notes. It's podinbox.com/thedivedown. It's the name of the show you're listening to.
podinbox.com/thedivedown. All one word. All one URL.
And, I was thinking about the name of that website, Pod Inbox, and I was like, it should be Pod in a Box, but no, it's like an inbox for your emails.
Oh, so it's Pod Inbox. It's not Pod Inbox.
No, it's Pod Inbox.
Oh.
Did you guys really think it was something else?
It's not Pod Inbox. It's Pod Inbox.
Thanks to sponsors Pod Inbox this week. We appreciate you.
PODDN_box.
Yeah, Pod Inbox. Hey, a couple people did leave us messages, though. We have 2 new reviews this week from The Roast Doctor and Ion Don Pod Fan.
I think it's London Pod Fan, my friend.
Is that an L?
It's a lowercase L.
I'm going to try that again.
London I like it the way it is. That's perfect.
Man, it's going to be a good episode.
I'm tired.
We're really firing at all our cylinders.
I love ye old Iondon town.
Oh my gosh, Ion.
If you want to support the show, you can find our Patreon at patreon.com/thedivedown. You can also support us while playing Magic. With the Mana Traders promo code TheDiveDown2021, first 2 months, get 15% off with promo code TheDiveDown2021. Guys, I'm just going to keep talking. Can I take us through this breakdown?
No, let's talk about the historic bands.
Let's talk about Historic Band real quick. We've enjoyed Historic. You've enjoyed Historic.
Yeah, I played some today.
And so you probably have some thoughts about what just happened last
October
week.
13th, 2021.
Yeah.
Okay, standard, no changes.
Okay, good. Because, we're not a standard podcast, so perfect.
Tybalt's Trickery is banned in Historic. Memory Lapse is suspended in Historic. Read banned in Historic. Brainstorm is banned in Historic from suspended, where it was already hanging out.
Got him.
And, okay, let's talk about that before we talk about the next thing, because that's also a really interesting topic of conversation, I think. So we have basically 2 new bans and 1 suspension becoming a ban. Tybalt's Trickery. Stan, that's basically just kind of a busted best of 1 deck that was kind of always lurking, always being annoying.
Yes, good riddance.
Yeah.
It did not provide any positive interactions for this format except like very quick coin flippy games.
Is this one of the worst cards they've ever printed at this point? Like, most annoying worst cards ever been printed. Fastest ban in modern history a couple months back. Now it's gone from Historic as well after being a nuisance to people for a long time. I mean, it wasn't totally destructive to the format, but geez, it turned out to be a card that wasn't good for anything other than this.
I think what's interesting is that it was very good enough for best of 3 modern, because that's the only way you can play it. But I think it was not a scourge of best of 3 Historic. I think it was just one of those things that unless you were planning on hating it out game 1 with like main deck hate of some kind, that it would just run over you with the combo. And you didn't, there's no sideboard, so there's no chance for you to shore up that matchup in best of 1. So, and there's so much best of 1 being played. I'm surprised it lasted this long, honestly.
Yeah. Do you remember when they tried banning cards just in best of 1?
Oh, yeah.
Didn't they only ban Nexus of Fate in best of 1 for a little bit? And
that sounds right.
It's weird. I'm glad they just banned it outright. Good riddance, as Stan said.
Agreed.
All right, let's talk about a more important card, a more interesting card, a card closer to our hearts, I guess, that was suspended, and that is Memory Lapse.
Yeah.
Stan, how many decks over the last 4 months did you play that have Memory Lapse?
Many.
What percentage of the decks that you played in Historic do you think had Memory Lapse in them?
Oh, wow. At least 60%.
Yeah.
Because I had like my Is It Control Brew, I was playing Jeskai, I was playing the Indomitable Creativity decks. It was just the glue that made blue the best color in the format. Memory Lapse was, I really think. Oh, and there's Rogues, lest we not forget. It was maybe the first deck to break out with the addition of Memory Lapse. This suspension model, I don't think it's working for anyone. I can think of one card, just off the top of my head, Burning Tree Emissary, that went from suspended to playable again. But other than that, any card that needs to be suspended, I think at this point they have enough data to indicate it doesn't belong in the format. That's why they're suspending in the first place. And it almost feels like they're just holding our wild cards on layaway.
Yeah, which is weird. It's like they don't need to do that. You know what I mean? It's like it's going to come out in the wash as it is. Like nothing's going to hang out and suspended for like 2 years. So it's just like you said, it's just a weird model. It's not like a clear model either. Like what their purported and ostensible use of it is, like you said, has not really come into play at all, besides Burning Tree Emissary. And feel free to correct me, audience, if I am wrong. Shout from the heavens. But it's just a silly concept. It's almost like they've been beta testing it in the digital environment, and I think it's kind of fine to call the experiment a failure and just be clear with it.
That said, I think most people are pleased that this card is gone. Maybe not Stan. I liked playing with Memory Lapse decks, but it stinks to be on the losing end of a Memory Lapse deck. If it cuts you off of like land drops, sometimes just buying enough time is good enough for those control decks or those blue X decks to find whatever answers they need to. And it was really easy for a lot of those decks to just run away with the game after a couple timely Memory Lapses put whatever their opponent was on the back foot.
Isn't it amazing that because of how kind of proactive a lot of the decks turned out to be in Historic, the decks that ran Memory Lapse, sometimes they were running Creativity and stuff like that. So they were trying to get to a, turn 4-ish kind of time to really go off. Isn't it amazing that Counterspell was pre-banned and Memory Lapse got to hang out in the format for a while? And ostensibly, I think in Historic, Memory Lapse is better than Counterspell in pretty much every way possible because it takes that draw away from your opponent.
Yeah, it stinks, and I don't like it.
Yeah. So, but also good riddance. Memory Lapse. Bye. Whatever. See ya.
Well, it might come back in 3 months. Probably
Maybe.
not, though. All right, last bit of news in this BNR that is very unique. 5 of the digital-only cards from Jumpstart Horizons, meaning these are cards that had digital-only mechanics that have not been printed in paper and likely will never be printed in paper in any form, have been rebalanced, meaning the way the cards worked is a little different now.
Yeah.
For instance, Faceless Agent was a 3-mana 2/1. Now it's a 3-mana 2/2.
Sweet.
Davriel's Withering can now only target creatures an opponent controls because I believe their testing identify that the combo with, it's not Flickerwisp.
Vesperlark.
Yeah.
Too oppressive. Not that that deck was particularly popular. Still, they decided to change Davriel's Withering. Also, they updated Sarkhan Wanderer and Subversive Acolyte.
Don't forget Davriel's Soul Broker. His third ability only affects target creatures opponent controls as well. So you can't target your Vesperlark or any creature with that.
I think perhaps more importantly than kind of breaking down these specific changes and whether we like them or not, how do you feel about updates to digital-only cards?
People definitely had some takes on these, and I'm curious if they had played a lot of digital games in the past, like digital TCGs, or excuse me, digital CCGs, because you can't trade anything, because people were pretty peeved. Like they were like, at least we should get some wild cards back for these changes, because now Davriel's Withering is essentially useless to me. I made this deck that's based around Withering and perhaps even Davriel's Soul Broker, and so it's like, hey, effectively you ban the card, so I should get some wild cards back out of it. I don't think that has been a universal in things that I've seen, where when cards get nerfed, you did not always see some kind of credit come back to you. Do you know what I mean? Like in other digital games where it's like, hey, changes are going to happen. And that's part of the design and conceptualization of the game from the ground up, is that we're going to rebalance things. We're going to try to make certain strategies more powerful, certain strategies less powerful, and that's the price you pay. I think a lot of this stuff happens because of just the sheer cost of Magic Arena and how hamstrung you can feel from your wildcard collection. Whereas a lot of other games, you do seem to just build your collection a lot more quickly, so the changes don't feel quite as backbreaking. Because it's like, hey, so what if I put 20 odd wildcards into this deck? I've got 127 of them because they're just so flush just by playing the game. What do you all think?
I think the biggest concern that I have here is more about some of the other things that they said, where they want to rebalance, bring some of the mirror cards back permanently, potentially, and use Arena as a way to rebalance the paper experience, or rebalance what could have happened in the paper experience, further splintering what's going on in Arena away from what happens in paper. And that is a big worry to me, to be honest.
Why are you worried?
Well, just because I think that it's going to make, I really feel like for me to enjoy Magic the most, I want to be able to sometimes play it online and sometimes play it with my friends and have that be kind of one set of problems that I'm thinking about, and not have to try to track the differences between Oko as in paper and Oko as in what got printed on Arena.
Yeah, that's exactly the card I was going to bring up. Just like, I don't want to think about fixed Oko. Like, I don't want to have to worry about, whatever version they want to test is like some better power corrected Oko. I just want to have as much of a mirror of the paper experience as possible. And that was, this, I don't want to rehash our arguments and discussions from months ago on these digital only historic cards, of course. But yeah, I don't want that showing up in another version.
I will say the reason why I'm not as worried about it is because I don't want historic to be a paper format. Like, I kind of like the idea of having this purely digital experience and not having to worry about collecting another set of cards for a very specific format that may or may not translate to more powerful formats like Modern or even Pioneer potentially. So having some of this digital only experiences that just kind of makes Arena more of a cell phone game, I don't think that necessarily makes Magic worse. It just kind of separates the formats and the play experiences a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I just think it makes me a lot less likely to ever go back to Arena at this point, just because I just don't have that much headspace for all this stuff. And so
Exactly.
it's pushing me back to Moto, honestly. When a year ago we were all like jumping into Arena.
I just want to think about it. I just don't. I don't really care about it being different or like not being able to be replicated in paper. I just don't want to have to think about what did they do to fix Oko? What did they do to fix Omnath? You know what I mean? I just don't have to worry about it.
Hot take. I have a feeling anything they do to these broken cards to make them, quote, fixed will still just make them unplayable. And they'll either be too expensive or not impactful enough to really be worth running in a deck. Might end up being wrong on that, but that's kind of my assumption. It's like these cards were designed in a certain environment to do a certain thing. And once you change whatever that thing is, they're just not going to be very good anymore. Or they'll just end up being too broken again. And they'll have to keep errataing them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. Bring Pioneer to Arena, I guess, if you ever want me to pay attention to it, honestly.
Yeah, or make Modern really bad again.
Or bring Modern to Arena, which I think is extremely unlikely, but...
Oh, man, please. Let's do this.
Speaking of Modern,
yeah,
there's Pro Tour qualifier events still going on in the format, or on MTGO at least.
It's funny they're called the PTQ, I think literally on their calendar. It's called the PTQ, but it should be like a SCQ, Set Championship Qualifier.
it should be a WKQ, a who knows qualifier, because who knows what event these people are really queuing for at this point.
Yeah, I really don't know what a Set Championship is.
Well, it's called the Modern Premiere in the results page.
You don't know what that is? It's not clear enough to you, Dave?
I like that better at this point. Like, let's just acknowledge that it's a high stakes online tournament instead of, and that's fine. Let's have the qualifiers and super premiere and all that kind of stuff. Like, at least that makes more sense at this point to me. Anyway, it's kind of semantics.
Yeah, I mean, what these are just things you have to use qualifier points to enter. So you have to have proven your mettle in like leagues or other events to get in. Like, you can't just pay to play. You have to qualify to play.
I don't know if you guys saw this, but I was up at 4 o'clock to change a baby's diaper.
Because I was up at 5:45.
Do you have enough QPs?
Well, I just checked in on Discord, and Mickey was up for whatever reason as well. Shout out Turtle Power, and he's like, "There's a PTQ starting in an hour. Who's up for it?" And I was like, I'm awake. I should do it, right? And then when I went to look at how much it costs, because I have like 100 ticks, I was like, sure, I'll spend some ticks on this, do some episode prep. Turns out it takes QPs. Couldn't play.
Yeah.
How many QPs do you have, Stan?
I should check. I don't know, like a handful.
3.
I have 1.
Because I think you get them if you 4-1 or better.
Yeah.
I think you get 1 if you 4-1.
They've just expired. My previous ones have just expired, so
yeah.
I have 1.
Dave didn't use his Kroger gas pucks in time.
Whoops.
So what we're going to do today is go over the Saturday Modern Premiere results. Thanks in part to Bamzing's recap, but all the deck lists are up now on magic.wizards.com. So I'll just go through the top 8, unless there's anything we should mention up top.
Oh, let's just go through the whole 16. We got 16 decks. They don't give us a top 32.
Yeah, we can do it. Let's go. Let's start at the top.
All right, cool. First place, Hammer Squats on Blue-White Control.
Going to be talking about this a little bit later, or something close to this, right, Stan?
Yeah, so after these results came out, I fired up a league with this version of the deck too, though the one I had done previously for our testing was quite similar. These decks are pretty much like the same 70 out of 75 these days.
One thing I liked and noticed is the increase in Sunset Revelry in the board, up to 3 of those, telling that Nammer Squats, I think, has their finger on the pulse of the meta.
Yeah, burn is tough for Blue-White Control right now. I think you kind of have to build it a little bit to be able to beat burn.
That's certainly one way to do it.
I have stuff to say about burn later, too, in my deck, but anyway.
Second place, Glacier 7 on 4-color Sky Noodle featuring Yorion. This one had 4 Obsidian Charmaw in the sideboard, which I can only assume, this is the dragon. You pay 5 at ETBs to destroy a land that taps for colorless. I don't think this is Tron hate. I think this is Urza Saga hate.
I think it's both. I think it helps you in
it
either
serves
case,
both
right?
purposes.
Why not
I don't
both
think they're metagaming against Tron particularly.
I mean, I saw a good amount of Tron this week, but I know there's probably not any in this top 16, but...
Well, we'll find out.
I saw green-black Tron. Anyway,
Ooh.
you want to go in the Wayback Machine.
Archive.org. Third place, Basic Forest on Boros Burn.
No Basic Forest in this deck.
Fourth place, Fur MTG on Boros Burn. The third place list did not have Luris. The fourth place list did.
Definitely featured Luris.
Fifth place, Nico Koniko?
Yeah, Nico.
Nico on Orzhov Hammertime with Loris. This one had 4 Ingenious Smith, no Giver of Runes in the main deck.
More on that later.
Got some stuff to say about those flex slots.
Kind of interesting. 6th place, X-Whale on Orzhov Hammer. This one had 3 Smiths, also no Giver of Runes, however, but a singleton Steel Shaper's Gift, which is a card that has been waning out of the deck since some of its earliest forms. Also a single Cranial Plating, which kind of comes and goes, right?
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those flex artifacts. Some people seem like they're running Graveyard Hate. Some people seem like they're running maybe a Cranial Plating for just extra bashing. What I liked about this deck is that they ran 2 Knight of Infamy in the sideboard, which has pro white, probably one maybe good against the mirror, also very good against Solitude, which is much more popular than it used to be.
And Prismatic Ending.
Yeah, Prismatic Ending. What's funny, though, is that something having pro white also has protection from Sigarda's Aid. So you cannot target it with Sigarda's Aid's ability to equip a hammer.
Yeah. Will tweeted about this after the tournament and was like, he talked a little bit about maybe switching to Knight of Valor. I don't know if he was kidding or not, but
I don't know.
It was a good idea to just try to get some production stuff in there, but you kind of lose what you're really looking for around the edges without Sigarda's Aid, of course.
You can still use Pure Seal Paladin, though, to equip to Knight of Infamy.
Yeah.
7th place, GPSN 54. What is this deck? On an Ephemerate deck? Red-White brought back. That's what that is.
Yeah, this is the Red-White brought back that did the wild stuff, let's read brought back in case people don't remember what this card does. So this is an instant from M20. It costs white. And it says, choose up to 2 target permanent cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. Return them to the battlefield tapped. How do you feel about this card with Fury or Solitude?
Ooh.
Or, a fetch land even, or Showdown of the Scalds after it goes away. So there's a lot of different angles to using this. And yeah, I know that brought back's a card that some people have been looking around for a while at, and here it is.
Please, this is a Showdown of the Scalds deck. Modern Superstar.
It's a source of card advantage, and then it does that kind of like prowess thing that it does where you get to cast spells to keep it going. And it's not non-creature spells. It's whenever you cast a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. You can do some fun things with this.
Yeah, Cool Deck Inc.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I just read it real quick? So this deck is 4 Esper Sentinel, 4 Fury, 4 Ragavan, 3 Ranger Captain of Eos to go and get your Esper Sentinels and Ragavans.
Mm-hmm. Also good with brought back.
And Walking Ballista. I'll also go with brought back because you can sacrifice it. Yeah, 4 Solitude, 1 Thraben Inspector, 1 Walking Ballista, 3 Cleansing Wildfire, 1 Prismatic Ending, 4 brought back, 4 Ephemerate, and 4 Showdown of the Scalds.
1 Savai Triumph, 1 Wisp Chief, 1 Mountain.
Let's stop there.
Sweet deck.
Yeah. Really interesting. I wonder if this will take off. I believe Spike was one of the people who was brewing with brought back when that first came out around M20. Haven't really seen it make much of a splash since then. I wonder if people will take notice now. It's also a Flagstones of Trocare deck, right? It's got that Cleansing Wildfire Flagstones combo. And you can target the lands with your brought back as well. So you can use Cleansing Wildfires with Flagstones to just get a bunch of mana while also replacing the Wildfire with the card that draws.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah, maybe that's how you get to your Showdown of the Scalds as quickly as turn 3. And at that point, it actually seems halfway playable.
Oh, but only halfway. All right, 8th place is Jund Saga. More on this deck later. Nothing too interesting about this particular build. Leviathan 102 was the pilot.
Big JC 00 on Amulet Titan. As stock as I know Amulet Titan to be. 10th place, Sneaky Misato. I know that name. On 4-color Yorian Ephemerate Sky Noodly stuff. Looks like the rest of those decks have been looking. Sam LG01 on Amulet Titan. Looking pretty stock as well.
2 Amulet Titan in this top 16. Interesting.
Yeah, Amulet Titan is back, I guess. Zonda, 12th place on Boros Burn featuring Luris. They have a 1 of Flame Rift in the main over any kind of Skullcrack effect. And I like this choice of 2 Exquisite Firecraft in the sideboard. Finishing off control opponents through counter magic feels pretty smart these days.
I believe it. 13th place, Soul Strong on Teamer Rhinos.
Still here.
Yeah, basically still the same deck. Now becoming a Seasoned Pyromancer deck as well. 14th place, Contrago with Urza. Esper Urza? Blue-white Urza?
Just blue-white. Yeah, this is the
Yeah, like-
Urza plus Stoneforge Mystic build that we talked about a couple of weeks
Saga
ago.
Blade.
Saga Blade, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's got your Urza Saga, it's got your actual Urza, and it's got Stoneforge Mystic. So it's got the Thopter Foundry plus the, all the stuff you can do with Stoneforge, including Nettle Cyst and Cauldron Complete and all those kind of things. So, yeah.
And it's a Yorion deck. So they got room for all these accidental combos. 15th place, Shatoon on Boros Burn. This one does have 4 Dragon's Rage Channeler and 4 Mishra's Bauble instead of Rift Bolts and Skewer the Critics.
Interesting.
16th, Gideon Ravensword on Living End. And that's all we have for now. In terms of the overall meta share of this tournament, most popular deck was Burn.
With 4?
Boros Born, 4 copies.
Yeah, 2 with Luris, 1 without Luris, 1 with DRC. So there's a variety of burn flavors.
Are they really that different?
Just a little bit. I actually never really found Luris that amazing when I was testing Burnout a couple weeks ago. It's just there. It's like, it's good when you can get to it, but it's not part of game plan A at all, or even B, I would say.
Yeah, whenever I played Burn, the times I experimented with Luris was I didn't really feel like it was worth the sideboard slot. I almost felt like that real estate could be useful for an extra Skullcrack or Smash to Smithereens or a Wear and Tear.
Yeah, well, one of the players did decide that because there was no reason for them to not run Burn from what I could tell from their list.
Right.
Or to not run Luris, I mean, so...
Then we had 2 copies each of 4-color Ephemerate, an Orzhov Hammer, and Amulet Titan. So Titan maybe making a little bit of a comeback. And then the one-ofs were Azorius, Chalice, Control, brought back Jund Saga, Teamer Rhinos, Azorius, Saga Blade, and Living End.
Cool.
No Murktide. Do you guys remember Murktide?
Yeah, I'm sad it's kind of going away because I just picked up a couple Force of Negations. I mean, I guess they're useful elsewhere, but...
I think it's a good enough card, Shane.
Yeah, I think it's okay.
I didn't realize Murktide ran Force of Negation.
Oh, of course it does. Man, this Modern is so dynamic. Like, I love it. It's just like Burns rising, Elementals is falling, like the 4-color Noodle Ephemerate is just a thing that's here. Titan's even coming back. It's, Modern is so good.
Yeah, I think the good news is no shortage of decks for our Road to Las Vegas segments.
Yeah. Stan, you want to do Sky Noodle?
Well, I thought we could make Dave play Amulet Titan.
Dave loves it.
No, please.
Wow, all the color just left Dave's face.
Can I do a fast cool deck ink, please?
Please.
Okay, Saturday's challenge, Talisker, known OK Magic online player, got first place with Jeskai Moonblade, and this is almost like a red-white prison style deck, but the prison elements are really only Blood Moon and Chalice of the Void. And so it kind of runs your usual suspects of like Bone Crusher Giant, like stuff that's not 1 mana. So Bone Crusher Giant and Seasoned Pyromancer and Fury and Stoneforge Mystic and Prismatic Ending, Lightning Helix for your 2 mana interaction. And then it has, of course, the swords like Fire and Ice and Cauldron and Batterskull. And then the blue aspect is really only for Teferi Time Raveler. And then a few sideboard slots like classic modern sideboard card Geist of St. Traft, in case you need a hexproof creature to finish things off, and Flusterstorm for Rhinos, and a card that we talked about, Dave, I think when Stan was off, Dennick Pious Apprentice as a 2 of. It's a disturb creature. The front side is white and a blue for a 2/3 lifelinker human soldier. And it says, cards in graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities. And then the disturb side is just, something else. It's a 3/2 that does stuff. But I think you really are playing it for the front side, honestly, right?
Against Luris decks? Because this doesn't do anything against Living End.
Nope, it doesn't.
I feel like this is just anti-Luris tech.
Sure. I mean, there's some stuff that you might target. All the Snapcaster decks that are just the scourge of the meta, Stan.
That's true. Fair point.
Yeah, I mean, it does hose Luris, and there's quite a few Lurises out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly what this is for, but okay.
I'm sure the internet will let us know eventually.
Yeah, send us an email. Get in our pod inbox.
Pod inbox. I also want to mention that there were 3 Charbelcher decks in this top 32, so do not sleep on Charbelcher, apparently.
Yeah. Also, so much so that the winner of today's challenge, the Sunday challenge, was Sodak on Belcher.
Oh my gosh.
And Sodak said it's clearly the best combo deck in the format.
I've been surprised that people have been sleeping on it for so long, because it always did feel like it was doing something particularly unfair. So I'm glad it's back because it just forces people to change their decks around and think about something else that's not what I'm doing, hopefully. Speaking of something that I'm not doing, there were 6 Teamer Footfalls decks in this top 32. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I played against that deck this week, and I forgot how bonkers it can feel against you. Like, just what it can do so quickly and turns the corner so quickly.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
Yeah, I like that deck a lot.
You know, it's funny, for so long you were like, I don't think that's a real deck.
Yes.
I still don't. I still don't think it's real, but it's like my dreams, Dave. It haunts me.
Your dreams of bad takes, past bad takes.
I only have good takes, Dave.
Well, they're well said, at least.
Here's a question. Anything, before we wrap up on the breakdown, anything in these results that you think warrant an urgent deck exploration? So let's say, we probably aren't, but let's say we were to do another Road to Vegas episode next week. Anything here that we need to jump on this to get a sense of what's up? Or do these all kind of seem like, with the exception of like our mainstays, our Burns and our Jund Sagas and what have yous, everything feels pretty experimental and even a little fringy and just demonstrative of how diverse and wide open the format can be in the hands of skilled players.
The only one that's on my mind right now over the past couple of weeks is 4-color ephemerate Sky Noodle decks are starting to be all over.
And none of us have actually recently tested Rhinos for a bit, so...
I mean, Stan was playing it a few months back, but...
Oh, for sure. But I'm saying in terms of like in the framework of this episode.
Yeah. So maybe that's another one to keep in mind. Although I think Rhinos is a little bit on the wane.
6 in the top 32, Dave.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, 6 in the top 32.
It's waning.
Hey, if Sodek thinks that Belcher is the best combo deck, maybe we should be keeping an eye on that again after we tested it before.
Give me a deck that wins on turn 3 or doesn't. I'm fine with it.
Okay.
What's your do you have any thoughts there, Stan, or do you think there's one that needs to go immediately to the top of the queue?
Not really.
Okay.
Amulet, I think Amulet is worth exploring just because, when Shane and the Mishra's Babel fellas did their episode and F. Polish was talking about how Amulet's dead, he'd love to be playing it, it's one of his favorite decks. But we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks, and breakdowns especially, that people are doing well with Amulet, and I'd love to kind of explore the question of why did we feel that way, a month or two ago, and what's changing now that the deck is actually having maybe a minor resurgence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that Dom Harvey split the finals with friend of the show Mana Symbol in a real life paper event. I think around where they live, and he was on Amulet Titan, so he knows what he's doing. Yeah,
Mana Symbol's creativity tech also. I'm just mentioning that it exists and probably worth exploring in a little bit more detail too.
One card that I've started to notice a little bit more as we've looked through some of these is like the next tier down of stuff is people are starting to play straight up like Stoneforge decks with Culture Complete again, which is pretty interesting because if there's no Path to Exile floating around, Culture Complete's a little bit scarier, I think. It has a little bit more space because you can't kill it, basically.
The real thing that sucks is that you get the germ token with Prismatic Ending, and then you have a really expensive equip cost.
Oh, right.
With Calder Complete. That's kind of the bummer about it.
You can also Solitude it. I played against the Stoneblade deck with blue-white this week, and Solitude just felt like it
destroys it.
Yeah.
Solitude's good.
It's one of those problems where it's like if your threat's not 1 mana and can be interacted with some of these like Prismatic Ending or Solitude, it's just like, man, it's really tough to play sometimes.
Yeah.
Unless you have other ways of making those cards less effective.
Yeah. All right. Well, why don't we talk a little bit more about the decks we actually played this week? So we're going to take a break for a minute, but stay with us.
And we're back. So, in case you didn't listen to our previous episode 144, our first attempt at this Road to Las Vegas segment, what we're trying to do is explore some of the most popular and successful decks in the modern format right now in anticipation of the CFB Las Vegas tournament happening the weekend of November 20th, I believe, in Las Vegas. It's the weekend before American Thanksgiving, basically. And what we're trying to do is go a little deeper than what we might do on a Sleeve Believe Heave episode. Maybe not go in the exact same depth that we would on a deck dive episode. We're not going card by card per se, but trying to understand how successful have certain decks been Why are they successful? How do they look against other popular strategies within the current format and metagame? Any other tips and tricks that you might have or may need for playing them, and advice for or against playing them. What makes them a good selection, what makes them a potentially questionable selection right now. So we really appreciate all the feedback we got from that episode a couple weeks ago when Shane and I talked about Murktide and Burn. We wanted to do another one and maybe even do more of these in the weeks to come because it seems like people seem to enjoy them. Someone even mentioned it in those reviews that we thanked them for at the top of the episode in Housekeeping. I think it was
Was it Ion Don?
Yeah, Ion Don was a fan.
The Ion Don is one of my favorite DC villains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Italian chemist, physicist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's really good at passing through semi-permeable barriers with his ions and then the mafia as well.
Right. So that's what, these Road to Las Vegas episodes are about. And as I mentioned on this week's episode, we do 3 more decks. Dave is going to talk about Jund Saga. I will cover Blue-White Control, and Shane will revisit Hammertime. So that being said, Dave, kick us off. How'd you feel playing Jund Saga?
Jund. You know what? We have a long and complicated history with Jund, do we not?
Do we?
How far in?
It's one of our classic bits.
Mm-hmm, where the immortal words said mid-range is dead. How many episodes in was that? 3? Is it 4 episodes in?
I don't know. Do we? I forget when we even covered real Jund. Do you know what I mean?
I think it was episode 9. It was one of the first ones where we did the huge. It was one of our first deck dives that we did.
We did so many deck dives early on.
I know. Yeah.
So ambitious.
So Jund, here it is. It's in some ways it's the same deck. Same as it's always been, and in some ways it's a totally different deck from the way that it's been. It's funny, I think if you think about the provenance of where Jund is right now, it's sort of a combination of 2 different things. One is the kind of early red-black mid-range decks that came out of the red-black Lurrus piles that came out of Modern Horizons 2, kind of crossed with some of the staples of Jund over the last couple of years that kind of incentivized moving this deck from just being that red-black mid-range over to a 3-color deck. And so, for example, if you don't remember the red-black deck, that deck, in addition to Dragon's Rage Channeler and Ragavan as part of your threat suite, you had your Lightning Bolt, you had your Unholy Heat, and your discard suites with Inquisition and Thoughtseize, you had Terminate, you had Kolaghan's Command, like those kind of cards. Additionally, it also had Torok, Kroxa, and Dauthi Voidwalker, in addition to some berry effects like Terminate, things like that. That was a good deck, I thought, and I think it was good for a certain moment in time. But if you think about what Jund can really do, or what Jund generally really wants to do, is to try to just get to that grind state where all of your cards are worth more than 1 card and can sometimes be used to get multiple threats out on the board or do other things like that. You start to push back towards that green color for a couple of reasons. One is Renin 6 obviously becomes a good thing to be able to use to make sure you make all your land drops, and then also play with Tarmogoyf as a cheap threat that just kind of is big and can sometimes get outside of Unholy Heat range. So if there's not a ton of Fatal Push floating around, I think Tarmogoyf starts to get better, even though Solitude is still out there and Prismatic Ending is still out there. There's still a little bit more space maybe for Tarmogoyf to be something that's useful in the metagame where maybe over the summer it wasn't quite as useful, or maybe we just hadn't figured it out yet. But the biggest thing that I think happens with all of this, or the thing that really makes this version of Jund different and was surprising and innovative when it popped out, is that once you move towards Renin 6, you start to have a lot of incentive to play Urza's Saga in a deck like this, which I think was really surprising to me. I never kind of saw it coming that Urza's Saga would go into a deck with Dragon's Rage Channeler and Ragavan and all the discard cards. But there's space to make it work. You play your Mishra's Bauble package because you want to have Lurrus anyway. You start using spell bombs. You put a Shadow Spear in there, and suddenly you have a package with that in Renin 6 where you can make a bunch of creatures in the mid-game. You can search up an answer that you need with the tutor ability of Urza's Saga to shore up matchups against graveyard decks and burn main. And so you get this kind of interesting twist on what I think is a really otherwise familiar deck. What are your thoughts on kind of the way that this deck, the Jund, is put together right now?
I mean, I think it kind of confirms this adage that Jund isn't just a deck, it's really a mindset, that anything can be Jund. And this is just the tools that we need right now to Jund out our opponents, to generate incremental card advantage, and grind with whatever good cards happen to exist in these 3 colors. The fact that it's potentially hurting its mana base a little bit for the sake of having just the access to the power of Urza Saga, I think is really interesting, and kind of, I think, points more to the fact that Urza Saga and Ren and 6 are insane cards.
Yeah, and this is basically Modern Horizons Tribal.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's got 4 of the best Modern Horizons cards that ever came out between Urza Saga, DRC, Ragavan, and Ren and 6. Now, Shane used to be kind of a Jund min. What do you think about this version of Jund, just kind of like top level before we go too much deeper about how this has evolved?
That's a good question. I think what's good, I mean, it gets to kind of, I think, the core of Jund philosophy, which is play the best cards with the most efficient mana costs as possible and get as much value out of them as possible, right? That's kind of always been, in my eyes, the idea of Jund, which is your resources have a higher card per card value and is less reliant on inherent synergies than many decks. So you can kind of come out ahead. Everything comes out ahead with you in over the wash of a game or a match, and you don't have very particular amazing matchups. You don't have particularly terrible matchups because of just the raw card value that you are presenting to your opponent and interacting with your opponent with. Would you say that's how this deck still feels?
I would. I mean, so a couple of things that I think are really surprising about it, and maybe I will, we could talk about that a little bit more. I guess one of the main things is like, it's a huge lowering of the mana curve in this deck. Jund used to be a deck that got away with running 4 drops. I mean, Luris is putting pressure on all decks like that, especially decks that want to grind in the format. So you're not incentivized to play Liliana the Veil. You're not incentivized to play Blood Raid Elf. They're probably both too slow at this point. Although I did see in last week's deck drop, there was a straight up old school Jund 5-0 that was like, we're just playing all the old cards, and it looked like it was from 2017. So I think it still plays that same game plan, but your cards are so cheap. You do so many things per turn now, where before, you were kind of pacing it out a little bit more. But I think the deck, we wanted to kind of share track record on these things too. The deck has been pretty successful lately. It hasn't been at the top of tons of challenges, but it's in that mix of decks that kind of come around. Some at the top, in a lot of top 8s. For example, in the challenge from October 10th, it came in 6th, 8th, 13th, and 17th. It came in 8th on the PTQ that we just talked about. It won a challenge a couple weeks ago. It hadn't placed in a lot of the other top 8s from this weekend, but I still think it's a good deck. It's a solid deck. It is kind of like the mid-range deck of the format in some ways, depending on what you draw up the definition of mid-range. And the thing that's most interesting to me is that as I looked through all these deck lists, that it is extremely settled on. Like the list, there's not a lot of, this is one of those decks at this stage of the format where there's not a lot of flex or variation between the styles of decks. It's got the creatures we talked about. It's got discard spells that I think we're familiar. There's basically 6 or 7 of those main. It's got the Saga package, which is basically always 1 to 2 Nihil Spellbomb, 1 Pirate Spellbomb, 1 Shadow Spear, occasionally a main deck Pithing Needle. That's it. The interaction suite is basically 2 Bolt, 4 Unholy Heat, and 1 Terminate or Abrupt Decay. And then it's got 23 lands. So it's got 1 or 2 flex spots in the main, and that occasionally becomes an Abrupt Decay, a K command, a Maelstrom Pulse, something like that. But that's pretty much it. And then the sideboard is a little bit spicier, where you see some people running Chalice, and some people running a bunch of Engineer Explosives, some people running a bunch of Doom Blades, other things.
Do you think this is just playing Chalice on 0 against Hammer?
So interestingly, I brought Chalice in a bunch of times against Burn, because I actually think that we can talk about this a little bit. And maybe, I don't know if that was right, but I would play it on 1 against Burn quite happily here and there. I played it against 2 on Burn one time when I knew that what they had in their hand was like double Boros Charm. And I was like, well, I'm just gonna play this and get it out, just try to get this out of their hand. I think that this format and most formats eventually find their mid-range deck, and this is just kind of it. It's a different take, I think, sometimes, because it's not quite so much a kill all your stuff and then attack deck. It's a little bit more of a disrupt what you're doing and play really efficient threats deck with good interaction as your backup. So against creature decks, you can just kill a bunch of their stuff. But in this one, you're so assertive with Dragon's Rave's Channeler and Tarmogoyf and Urza Saga tokens that you can put together a pretty aggressive plan where, you have a bunch of threats on turn 4, basically, where you're really putting pressure on someone to win early if they don't do anything about your board, while you've thought seized away a key part of whatever they're doing.
Right on.
But here's the biggest thing about Junt, though. I think before we start talking about individual matchups, this is like a pilot skill deck, I think. And I know we talk about that a lot, but this deck doesn't. And I know Stan's deck is going to be the same thing because he's going to talk about blue-white control. But I think that this is one of those decks in the format where you just get a lot out of practicing this deck and really being familiar with the format, because you don't really have a solid plan A in this deck all the time that fits every deck you play against.
Yeah, so it just kind of gets to that issue that we've talked about a lot in the Luris pile decks, and like we were saying a week or two ago, that this is perhaps just the consensus best Luris pile deck right now. It's how do you maximize value of each of these cards, because they don't necessarily do anything better than another card that's in your hand. So it's like, do I present this threat here, or do I present this, or do I try to interact here? And so there's a lot of things about when you choose to cast certain spells, when you choose to like what spell you actually cast, what creature you cast, or if it's a planeswalker or something like that. So I think there's a lot of choices, and as we always say, the more choices you make, the more opportunities you have to mess up,
or the more opportunities you have to outplay your opponent if you're good at Magic. Which
no, you only mess up.
Well, I only mess up, and you only mess up. But some of our listeners, I'm pretty sure they don't mess up. Yeah, so I think that it's a good point, Shane, to just mention that, Luris is a super popular card in Modern, obviously. It's in tons of decks, but this is that column of Luris pile decks kind of right now, the Luris mid-range decks, because Hammer is a Luris deck, but it's not a mid-range deck. It uses Luris for a reason, right? And because it can.
Yeah.
Burn also uses Luris as a tool, but it's not really part of the plan. I think in this deck, like, Luris is an important thing to remember that you can do so that you can turn the corner when you've kind of like misplayed or you've drawn badly in the mid game or something like that. It's kind of your ace in the hole that can get your whole thing going again. And the other problem with this deck, so that's like the pilot skill part. The other part of pilot skill that's really hard in this deck, I think, is that the mana in this deck is totally, I think, beyond fragile. I mean, it's like the most fragile mana base I've ever seen. So let's talk about it for a minute. There's 23 lands in this in most of the builds of this deck. Okay, I'm looking at a list from, and this is no criticism of the people who put these lists together, by the way. I just think that it's wild that this mana base seems to work for everybody who's doing well with the Junt. So this is a 5/0 deck by Simuraisu, who also did well in one of the challenges a couple weeks ago. This deck has 10 fetch lands. It has 4 Bloodstained Mire, 2 Verdant Catacombs, 4 Wooded Foothills, okay? It has 6 fetchable lands. I believe this particular build might have 7, actually, but it has 2 Blood Crypt, 1 Forest, 1 Mountain, 1 Overgrown Tomb, 1 Stomping Ground, and 1 Swamp. It has 7 fetchable lands, which isn't that unusual, I guess. But on the other hand, it makes it really hard to make sure that you, A, don't die to Blood Moon, and also make sure that you have the mana that you want at the times that you need it, because, of course, it also plays Urza Saga. So you get into this huge sequencing thing where, you basically have no cards in this deck that have colorless pips in the casting costs other than Nihil Spellbomb, Pirate Spellbomb, Shadow Spear, and Tarmogoyf are the only cards main deck that have colorless pips in the casting costs for the most part. So playing at Urza Saga is actually kind of actively like taking time off unless you're casting Tarmogoyf. And maybe that's another reason that Tarmogoyf is a threat that you play in this deck, is because it's a 2-drop that you can cast with an Urza Saga on board. It makes sequencing so hard because you want black early so that you can cast Thoughtseize. But then you need red because most of your cards are red and your most powerful threats are in red. But then you also need green because you really want to be able to cast Ren in 6. And so figuring out the way that you're going to work out what to fetch when, and when you get a basic land, when you get another shock, and how much you can hurt yourself against an aggressive deck like Burn or something like that, it's kind of all, it's all of a piece of this big problem of how to make a 3-color deck with Urza Saga work properly. Because I'll tell you what, the draws where you have double Saga are rough. They're rough.
Can you not play just like the Saga game where you're making constructs and hoping that they do the job for you?
You definitely can, but then you have, one of the big things about this deck is that you have proactive hand disruption, right? And so sometimes when you're on the Saga game, you have to sacrifice the fact that, hey, all I'm going to do is Thoughtseize someone, then play Urza Saga on turn 2, and then make a construct on turn 3. And like, that's not that great, especially when you only have, 7 or 8 artifacts main, where you might not have drawn those. So your constructs actually are kind of small in this deck. Mm-hmm. The thing that really happens with this, and we can talk a lot more about Urza Saga, of course, because I think what we should do is double back on Urza Saga when Shane talks about it in Hammer.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, you drop a bauble, you play a construct, then you play another construct, and you search up Shadow Spear, means that you have 2 4/4s. But before that, the first one is kind of small, right? Because it's a 2/2 at best. And I definitely had a couple times where my first construct was a 1/1 until I managed to really get things going on the 4th turn. So they can be kind of fragile and susceptible to removal in a way that like Goyf isn't. So then you're trying to figure out how are you going to work Goyf into this whole thing. And Goyf is just kind of like a giant construct in itself as well in some ways. I felt like I was pretty much always, of course, just grabbing Shadow Spear. That's basically what you're trying to do with this deck, unless for some reason you want to draw a card with Mishra's Bauble. But
this deck just loses to Blood Moon, doesn't it?
It's interesting. Yes, it definitely does. The build that I was playing was running Abrupt Decay main and another one on the side. So you could kind of like, if you had an inkling that Blood Moon was coming, you could prep yourself to play that card and search for it or be ready for it, and it works pretty well. But most of the time, yeah, you just die to Blood Moon. I mean, one of each basic land makes you so susceptible to Spreading Seas, for example, which seems to be the mana disruption du jour right now. But if you run against a deck with Cleansing Wildfire in it, you're just going to get taken out. If you run against a deck that has Ghost Quarter in it or something like that, somehow you're just going to get destroyed.
Before we get to the matchups, what drew you to this deck? Because you're not really a Jund player historically. Why did you want to do this?
I mean, I like playing the red-black mid-range deck a lot over the summer. I really liked that core. I've liked to play Jund Shadow and things like that. So yeah. I never really played Jund, although I have it. Mostly because I think that I never really enjoyed the fact that the Bloodbraid Elf Lily plan never felt quite as assertive as some of these later builds do. And so I did really enjoy piloting this deck. I did okay with it. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. But I really like Dragon's Rage Channeler and Ragavan. I have these cards. This is a deck that I would consider sleeving up to play because even though I do think it takes a lot of pilot skill, I also think that it's one that you can build long-term skill in this style of deck, and you just kind of tune up your matchups and get more aware of like the specific meta decisions that you need to make. So I think that's something you can improve quickly, and it's just kind of prepared for lots of things because it has Thoughtseize and Inquisition of Kozilek. And I think that those are both good kind of escape valves to have for a deck, especially if you go into a wide field like what MTG Vegas might be. Mm-hmm. So that's why I wanted to try it. And also, I haven't played a deck like this in a while, not since the summer. I haven't got to play a Tarmogoyf in a while. So, and last thing I will say is this felt like the most interesting way to use Urza's Saga to me. All the other decks that Saga is in feels kind of like, oh yeah, there's a bunch of artifacts in that deck. Of course you have Saga in it.
Sure.
But this one is kind of like, what's Urza's Saga doing there? How can you even make this work? And it does work for the most part, although it's tricky and you definitely pay for it.
Yeah. Seems like Urza Saga is really there just to make your Brennan sixes even better.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean it's certainly one of your primary threats in the deck, but also it makes Renin 6 into a legit mid-game threat because it brings creatures back suddenly before when it really didn't do that previously. All right, you guys want to talk about matchups for this deck? Okay, some quick thoughts. So the order that we had for this list was, the first one we had was Hammer. I didn't play against Hammer in the couple of leagues I played with this. I think that Jund probably has some game about it. I'll be curious to hear what Shane has to say from the flip side. But, you have non-damage removal, especially after sideboards. It doesn't really run much artifact removal at this point, but it does have things like Chalice. It has Engineered Explosives. It has Abrupt Decay. It has Terminate. Like, all of those things are cards that are good against Hammer and can buy you enough time to kind of make your threats go the distance, I think. So I feel like this might be a toss-up, but Jund pulls ahead after sideboarding when they can really up the number of destruction-based removal effects as opposed to damage ones like Unholy Heat. We'll hear Shane's side of it later. In the mirror, you know how it goes. It's the mirror. Burn. I think this game is really hard because the mana is greedy. You take a lot of damage from it. This is a classic story, right? Burn versus Jund is Burn's just going to take advantage of the fact that Jund hits themselves with all their mana and their thought seizes. So in game one, it's pretty tough to establish that, although you do have Shadow Spear main, and so you have a main deck out to, if you can go fast enough and get your Shadow Spear online fast enough, you can kind of turn the corner and come back. Really hard. Like, this is one of those situations where I feel like you might even want to play Urza's Saga very early so that you make sure that you're getting Shadow Spear extremely early. Like, I mean, I didn't get to try this line, but if I was looking at a hand that was like, you know, Overgrown Tomb, Urza's Saga, Tarmogoyf, and Bauble, and like some stuff where I felt like I was going to get enough cards in the graveyard, I might be tempted to like play Urza's Saga on turn 1 when I know that I can't make a construct on turn 2 and just try to get Shadow Spear tutored up as fast as possible, because they will just kill you if you don't have Shadow Spear, honestly.
And I feel like this is one of those matchups because you're 3 colors, because you're counting on Ren and 6 to generate a mana engine. Your lands are doing like 3 to 6 points of damage to you every game.
Oh, at least it's probably closer to 8.
Yeah.
I think it's between 6 and 8, honestly, is what I found. You know, you're fetching and shocking. Like that's what that's what this mana base does. Murktide. So I still kind of feel like there's a zone where Murktide and Jund are sort of like funhouse mirrors of each other in a little bit. Like, Murktide isn't really a control deck. It's a sort of a mid-range deck with counter spells, I think. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this is a mid-range deck with hand disruption. And so I think that you can kind of cause problems for them because you can terror Murktide and you're playing those kind of effects main. You can also then grind them out with Luris. You know, they have counter spells, so they can stop you from getting to that game plan sometimes. But I think that this might be a good matchup overall. You also have main deck Nihil Spellbomb. And so I think part of the reason that Jund has even ascended a little bit is because of Murktide being around, and if Murktide wanes, maybe there's less reason to play Jund. So we'll see. But I think this is a pretty good matchup for Jund.
I think so too. The fact that you have main deck Graveyard Hate just kind of makes Murktide itself seem really stinky.
Yeah.
And then like a 2/2/3/3 flyer is just kind of whatever. It dies super easily, especially when you have both Bolt and Unholy Heat in your deck.
Yeah. Living End. I think that because you have Thoughtseize and Inquisition of Kozilek, you can do some damage to them game 1, and then you can bring in Void Mirror and Chalice of the Void, additional hand disruption later. So I think and you also have main deck Graveyard Hate, so I think that this is a pretty good matchup for Jund, honestly. You know, sound off in the comments if you think I'm wrong. Elementals, I think this one's probably tough for Jund because it has a whole lot of creature kill, and you have a whole lot of creature kill, but your creature kill doesn't really line up that great because they're killing you with their creatures and bringing things back. And like, I think that they might be able to just have more cards than you have ability to answer in Elementals. And so I think that that's a pretty big beating, especially when people get to a point where they can hard cast a Solitude against you. So we'll see.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on all these matchups, you know, and some of them I'm just kind of guessing at this point, but having Doomblades and Bolts in the deck helps, but I don't think it's enough to stop them.
Oh, I'm going to go on one of my patented tangents later once I'm going through matchups and we get to Elementals.
Okay.
I love tangents.
A classic Stan rant.
Stan ranting, the usual.
Rantislav.
Well, I don't want to delay that too much longer. So let's go through the rest of what I have here. So Tron, you know, Tron versus Jund. It's often very tough for Jund because they can just play something that destroys you, basically. And so there you go. You have Alpine Moon, you have Void Mirror. Heat helps these days in the fact that you can like kill a Planeswalker and things like that. But they're you know, they can just go way over the top of you, and that's always a problem for a mid-range deck like this. I think Jund against Footfalls is kind of the same as Living End. I think it's pretty winnable. I think that you can kill their tokens, you can get around them, and you can have your threats go farther than theirs. Mill I worry about a little bit just because you guys are kind of like ships passing in the nights, but we haven't seen too much Mill the last couple of weeks, even though it was popular for a while. And then the last one I would talk about is Blue-White Control. And I actually think that the Chalice version of Blue-White Control is probably kind of a painful matchup for Jund because there are so many 1-drops in Jund now where it used to be more spread over the mana curve, and now you just drop Chalice on 1, and I often don't have a main deck answer to it, and then you die. I guess the main deck answer you have is Abrupt Decay and occasionally Kolaghan's Command, but you only have those as 1 or 2 of. So going in there game 1, it's pretty tough. There's not a lot of room for extras of those kind of things in the sideboard, so that's pretty tough. You know, I would think that it's probably in Blue-White's favor in this particular metagame, though I could be wrong.
Chalice on 0. I mean, I think the first Chalice you play against Jund, you want to play it on 1 because then you basically have countered half their deck.
Right.
Do you think putting Chalice on 0 just for, 4 baubles is worth it?
No, I think if you were to drop it on 2, you'd probably get more because then they can't play Run in 6.
Yeah.
And just do Saga over and over again. But like, I think Chalice on 1 is just enough to stop Jund in its tracks right now, which is really kind of a weird place to be. So we'll see. I've talked a little bit about the sideboards already. A lot of them are just shoring up against Cascade decks. There's some smaller metagame plays against artifact decks and big mana decks. Some extra graveyard removal and wider creature kill. That's kind of it. The sideboards might be too narrow as they're configured right now, but I think that there's so many different options across the 3 colors that I think you really can flavor to taste here, and that's where the decks had the most variation from each other.
One thing I remember about playing old versions of Jund, like Liliana Bloodbraid Elf Jund, was that games 2 and 3, you would sometimes take out like 7, 8 cards and bring in like half of your sideboard. Is that still the case here?
I think that the sideboards are spread a little more thin here, where there's kind of like really discrete packages against certain decks of 3 or 4-ish cards. I never found myself siding out like putting in half of my sideboard in any of the matchups that I played just because there weren't cards that were good against them. You power up a lot against graveyard decks because most of these have 4 Nihil Spellbomb in the 75, which seems aggressive to me, but people are going for it. I think the Cascade matchups are pretty good after sideboard, like I mentioned, and then the creature kill stuff is pretty good after sideboard as well. So I generally think that Jund is good if you really think that right now, I think it's best against Murktide and Hammer, personally. And so if you think we're going to have a resurgence of those metagames, I think that that's better. And then you can be a good pilot and work out how to gain edges against the rest of the field. Also, if you want to play like a fun interactive tournament with lots of decisions, of course, Jund is always the place to go. But it's risky to play this deck if you don't think you're going to have practice in some ways, or at least be able to really watch and study what kind of decisions need to be made, what kind of small decks are going to be there, what decks are trying to do, and how you can disrupt them and when to use your cards for this. Because, figuring out when to Abrupt Decay something, or when to let it stay out for another turn, or when to like play your threats, when to lead with Thoughtseize, like all that kind of stuff is so context dependent, of course, that like you need to be studied up pretty well. I think maybe more than you do with other decks. This deck is pretty vulnerable to burn, which is bad. I think this deck is pretty vulnerable to any deck that has Blood Moon in it. So if you're going to see those versions of Izzet decks floating around, I would be much less inclined to play something like this, where it kills your Saga and makes you unable to cast spells. Seems pretty bad. I think that almost every game you should be trying to aggressively fetch your basics just to like see what's going on before you know what's going on in the matchup that you're in for sure. So if you're playing a little bit in the dark, there are so many decks that randomly play Blood Moon that I would be trying to get my basics as much as possible. And then, like I said, I think it struggles against control. And so I'll be curious to see what Stan has to say about this matchup. But yeah, last thing, I liked playing this deck. It's too expensive. It's so expensive.
Why is Ren in 6 like $130?
I mean, it's $130 on Arena. On Moto, it's only $60 now, I guess. Wow, it's more expensive on tabletop now. It's a 1,200 ticket deck on Moto. I had to up to the ultimate subscription on Mana Traders for a month to play this. And, I do that for you all listeners, but that's not sustainable. It's like $100 a month subscription to be able to play this deck, and Elementals, I think, too. But
yes,
this deck's too expensive.
It's not just Ren in 6. It's also Monkeys.
Yeah, Monkeys.
Monkeys are insane. Bauble's insane.
Urza's Saga is pricey. Online is 50 tickets. Online, Bauble's around 20 tickets. Yeah, Ren is 50. Call it 60. Call it.
God.
And then Ragavan's still 100. So this is like the priciest deck that's floating around there right now. And, of course, I took it to a 2-3 and a 3-2. Although, in my own defense, I think I would have been on a much better roll if I was having massive computer problems where I kept having to punt matches. And so
blame the technology.
I'm blaming the technology this time. I think I would have done at least one match better if my computer hadn't crashed and timed me out a couple of times. But
guess we'll never know.
We'll never know because I'm never playing this again. No, actually, I'm going to load this up this weekend and probably play it some more.
So, if you were going to Vegas, hypothetically, what are the odds that you would play this actually in a tournament like that? Or alternatively, maybe you can call a shot. Like, how if Vegas was happening in a week, like, do you think this is a good pick for that tournament?
I think this is 7.5% of the field. Okay. I think it's under 10%, but I think it's a solid. I think it's the 5th most played deck or the 4th most played deck would be my guess.
I'll take that bet.
Okay.
I played Blue-White Control. I played a couple of versions of it, including the version that won the premiere on October 16th by Newmer Squats. Though, as I mentioned earlier in the breakdown, like most of these decks are pretty much the same these days. And one of the reasons why I picked it is because this deck has been very, very successful in Modern results lately. If you've been keeping up with our show, paying attention to our breakdowns, you've been hearing us mention Blue-White Control a lot.
I believe the challenge today that we talked about that Sodek won earlier, there were 3 Blue-White Control Chalice decks in the top 8. I think.
It came in second place.
Yeah.
Sodek, I think, had to beat Blue-White Control to win. I believe it won a Modern Challenge last week. Mm-hmm. It's constantly in the 3-1 and 4-0 bracket of the prelims. I think anyone who's paying attention to Modern would agree. It's undeniably one of the best decks in the format, if not the. And I think that's maybe where people might start to split hairs over what's the actual best deck. I don't know if I even think it's the actual best deck, but it's definitely up there. And, in an attempt to try to pinpoint what's been influencing some of its recent successes, I think it's a strategy that's benefited from a lot of new cards to enter the format this year, really over the last 6 months. And that includes MH2 cards, such as Solitude, as well as Midnight Hunt cards, such as Memory Deluge. Perhaps more importantly, though, and this is just a classic control thing, it just has this diverse suite of tools that lets it very effectively combat most, if not all, of the principal decks in the format right now. So maybe in a slightly different universe where we weren't all about 1-drops, maybe this wouldn't be a Chalice deck, or maybe in a more aggressive combo-heavy environment, Blue-White wouldn't be as good. But I think in the format right now, Blue-White decks have the tools to actually combat the metagame really effectively.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was going to ask you for a second was Chalice being in this deck is pretty unusual, right? Do you want to talk about kind of like what that's all about and how it's taking advantage of that opportunity right now?
Well, basically all this deck has to do is just not play 1-mana spells. And it's ultimately just replacing like possible cantrips to play Chalice instead and generating card advantage elsewhere.
And Path to Exile, right? That's also gone.
Yes, though you don't really need it. Like you have Prismatic Ending.
Yeah, and Solitude, so you don't need it anymore.
Exactly.
It seems like nobody needs it anymore.
Yeah, forget about it. Why did I buy those beautiful full RGP copies, Dave? No one knows.
Yeah, but Chalice is so good against so many decks because the mana curve on everything has gotten so far down. We just talked about how that happened with Jund, right? Yes. A deck that used to run 4-drops and 3-drops. Now it's all 2 and 1-drops. That's many different decks are doing the same thing because of Luris, but also just because of card efficiency.
And also because of Cascade. I think that's the real cherry on top of why Chalice is so excellent right now, is that you can just play a free card and practically nerf like 2 top decks in the format, both Living End and Footfalls.
Yeah, especially once you can protect your Chalice with counterspells, right?
Yes, yes. OG Counterspell, another new addition from MH2 that just makes control slightly better. And the mana is great. I mean, you have ways to play white and blue cards because of multiple Mystigates, a ton of gold cards. And because you're not playing 1-drops, and you can sometimes even play a Chalice on 0 with a turn 1 tap land, be it a Rogran Triome or a creature land, you still are like advancing your board state somehow. So Control great right now. Good tools, good position in the format, and it got sweet additions from some powerful recent sets.
Yeah, they're so sweet that I actually find it a little bit surprising how long, in quotes, like 3 months for Azorius Control to reassert itself as the premier tier 1 control strategy in the format. And that didn't take anything from Midnight Hunt necessarily, right? Like Memory Deluge certainly helps, but the Modern Horizons 2 cards were just so good. I think it just took time for as the old adage says, right, which is just the meta has to be in a place for Control to know what it's going to face more often than not, and everything settles down, and it's able to build a deck that knows what it's facing. And I think we're seeing the results of that.
I think that's a great point, because in the earliest days of the post MH2 metagame, I think that's when Murktide was its strongest, because it was able to play a counter control-y plan sometimes, or be very assertive. And blue-white control is not really an assertive deck. If you're ever being assertive, it's because the coast is clear to tap out for a Teferi or a Planeswalker, or trying to tap out for a Shark Typhoon or a Spreading Seas because you think that's going to get you ahead. The last thing I want to mention about blue-white control right now, it's also a companion deck. These decks just get to run Kahira. And the fact that you can play, this extra card in the sideboard and have like an additional threat, I don't want to overlook it. It's not necessarily the best companion by any means, but it's a 3-mana 3/2. Sometimes, it has vigilance. Sometimes it just gets there.
How are you mostly killing people with this deck? Is it mostly Shark Typhoon kind of based, or are you killing people with Jace, or what? Like, what do you think is going? I'm sure it's matchup dependent, but
yeah. So to answer your question, Dave, you're getting people to scoop to you.
Okay.
That's
Fair.
really what it is.
Yep.
You just end up in this position where you have 6-7 cards in hand, and you're fate sealing them with Jace, and people just see the writing on the wall.
Yeah, you're like, I'm going to kill you with something eventually. We'll figure out.
Right. The times where I actually had to earn it, it's usually because of Celestial Colonnade or a Shark Typhoon, or even a Solitude that I've eventually hardcast.
A single Solitude hit against like a deck where you need to top deck a burn spell or something like that, and just cross your fingers that they don't have counter magic, and they hit you with Solitude. It's just like, well, this game's over.
Yeah.
Like, I have no way to kill the Solitude. This game's gone.
Game's over. Let's talk about some matchups, shall we?
Stan, you got through your upfront much faster than I did. I'm sorry I took everybody on such a long journey through Jund.
It's okay.
No one wants to hear about blue-white control.
Your voice is more pleasant to listen to than mine, so it was enjoyable. It's like a fireside chat, except in your green screen basement.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's start with Hammer. And Shane, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that this is a race. Because Hammer sometimes has just insane draws and can sometimes win out of nowhere. But I do think over 100 games, blue-white control is slightly favored.
Yes, I think it maybe is more than slightly right now, especially the realization that Solitude is an amazing Magic card just is really tough for Hammer. I think even Chalice on 1 can be really tough, because then you can't cast your hammers or anything out of your hand. You have to rely on like Urza Saga. The fact that you can run Graveyard Hate, the fact that you can run sweepers. It's just I think it's not even slightly in Control's favor. I think it can be I think it might be 55%.
Yeah, I mean, that was my feeling as well, that I have all the tools, and even, Spreading Seas, like Chalice on 0, Chalice on 1, everything tends to line up pretty well against Hammer. I think in some cases, blue-white was built to beat up on Hammer as well as other things. I just want to give credit where it's due. Like, Hammer will just sometimes win when you have your pants down.
Yeah, but I just feel like games 2, games 3, you're not going to let that happen. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're not going to keep a hand where you're like, well, on turn 4, I can sweep them. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to have some prismatic endings. You're going to have some Solitude effect. You're going to have ways to stop Hammer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Jund, Dave, totally agree. I think this is favored for blue-white control.
Yeah.
Similar story as Hammer. The blue-white answers, I think, just line up better than the type of answers that Jund has in this matchup. and your card advantage engine is stronger than just Luris or Ren and 6.
Or Saga.
Those are the two. Yeah, Saga too. And really your version of, as you pointed out, your version of Jund is so vulnerable to Chalice that sometimes you have to mulligan aggressively to get that Chalice, but then once you do, it really pays off. And then it doesn't take long for you to kind of maintain that advantage and hold it.
Yeah, and like a third of my cards don't do anything against blue-white control because they're creature kill.
Right.
So.
I do find that this is an example where sideboarding was really hard for me because I have all these relevant cards in the matchup and I just don't know what's bad against you. Like Rest in Peace is good against you. Celestial Purge is good against you. I think Spreading Seas and Shark Typhoon are also pretty good against you just because, having Typhoon to 2-for-1 or just present a threat is really important. And I don't likewise have a lot of dead cards in the matchup either. So this is one where I would actually probably side out Walkers and Memory Deluge and just try to recover my card advantage elsewhere and use my answers to deal with everything you're doing, in those early to mid-game turns. Burn. I think this is a little unfavored unless blue-white is built to beat up on burn, especially post-board.
Man, Stan, I just don't agree with this. I just don't. I mean, like we talked about this 2 weeks ago. I think that there's just so many ways that you have to stop what Burn's doing. But you go on. Tell me what you're thinking.
Yeah, so here's what I'm thinking. Sunset Revelry, really strong. It's only 2 mana. But this isn't a Snapcaster deck, and a single Sunset Revelry is not enough to stabilize. Chalice on 1, really good. A well-timed Smash to Smithereens feels like game over, especially because blue-white control right now is cutting on Force of Negations. Both lists I played had no copies of Force of Negation. So sometimes it felt like I could not protect my Chalice if I'm playing it aggressively on turn 2. And I don't want to play Chalice for 4 to have 2 counters on it, because then that shuts off my counter spells, which feel really important, as well as my Sunset Revelries are really important. Likewise, Solitude at 5 mana, you have to do it to 2-for-1 yourself to maybe get rid of an Eidolon or a Monastery Swiftspear or whatever. But waiting till turn 5 to hardcast that Solitude just feels like so... it just takes forever. And I feel like I'm usually dead by turn 4. And that's why Supreme Verdict feels really bad in the matchup too. Where it's like, I kind of feel like I have to keep it in to deal with like a bunch of 1s and 2s that you might present. But by the time I can actually get that online, like the burn deck has generated enough advantage.
So here's what it feels like on the other side, Stan, is, game 1, you have Dead Searing Blaze. You have all of your creatures that you really want to survive, not survive because of prismatic endings. You have Chalice of the Void turning off like a good portion of your deck on 1. And you're really relying on drawing that sideboard card, maybe games 2 and 3, but then you can't go down resources against the deck. So you're just like, well, did I get my 40% chance to get a smash, like hands 1 and 2? And if more than that, I can't keep mulling. And so, then you counterspell the second or third burn spell, and then you start getting your Solitude down, or you maybe sweep the board even on turn 4, and it's a game where your resources eventually seem to outclass what I'm doing with burn. And then I think you can definitely, if you think you're in a meta where you're going to face burn, which I think is basically every meta, you can just say, hey, I'm running 3 Sunset Revelry. I'm fine keeping Chalice in and just trying to fade Smash to Smithereens or countering Smash to Smithereens if they draw it like turn 3 or something like that.
So, I mean, I don't think we'd necessarily disagree that strongly, to be honest. I just think that burn puts a lot of pressure on control to have all the right answers at the right time. And I think burn is really good at keeping control on the back foot. So even though control does have the tools to stabilize eventually, if the burn player has really good draws and the control player kind of stumbles a little bit, especially in those early turns, then I think burn will eventually run away with the game. I also don't want to underscore like how powerful Skullcrack is in the matchup, just because if you only have 1 or 2 Sunset Revelries, sometimes that Skullcrack is enough to make sure that you never really recover.
Sure.
Skill testing game though. This is if you're going to play either burn or control in any tournament right now, I think this is a matchup that you have to practice because they're both such powerful decks, and it's a really tricky matchup.
I can't believe we spent so much time this episode talking about blue-eye control, Jund, and burn.
All right, let's roll through these.
Is it Murktide? I think blue-white is slightly favored again, though it can be skill testing. Though blue-white gets the edge because it has both Chalice and Teferi Time Reveler, while the Izzet deck has really good threats, as well as good answers to walkers in the form of Unholy Heat, not to mention the power level of a turn 1 monkey, or even, if Murktide is an 8/8 flyer, that's sometimes game over. Because blue-white has Teferi, it's just backbreaking against an unprepared control plan. And sometimes Teferi is enough to make 2 or 3 cards in the Izzet deck dead in hand forever. So I think that's pretty important and good. The Chalice is also great because it makes casting 1-mana spells impossible, and you have a ton of those. And then even the bigger walkers like Jason and the 5-mana Teferi will create this board state that will very quickly bury the Izzet deck in card advantage. And Izzet just doesn't have the walkers or really any tools to generate that much card advantage. Expressive Iteration being a 2-for-1 just doesn't really compete with a Planeswalker.
Yeah, and they all of those cards tuck Murktide too. Like Big Teferi puts it into the deck, the other two bounce it, so they all interact positively.
Living End, I think this is kind of split, though it's leaning unfavored for blue-white, because post-board especially, you'll draw your Rest in Peace and kind of just win the game on the spot. Other times, you might even stabilize with the Supreme Verdict, or so you'll think, and then they'll just cascade on the snapback, and then you lose really quickly.
Yeah, but you still have 4 Teferi. You still have 4 Teferi Time Reveler and 3 Chalice of the Void that both stop Cascade, right?
Yeah, I feel like this has to be favored for blue-white.
Don't you think that would swing it? Yeah, more. That was my kind of gut from the decks, but I mean, did you play against a bunch of Living End this round through or no?
They do run a bunch of Force of Negations, as well as Brazen Borrowers.
True.
And even Grief. So I think that a prepared Living End player does have the tools to kind of make sure that their combo is clear or protect themselves with their own counter magic.
Yeah, I think that's something people forget about those decks a lot, both of the Cascade decks, is that they run enough interaction to make it so that you just getting a piece of hate doesn't end a game necessarily all the time or even frequently.
Exactly, yeah. So I think it's kind of like who's got the hate, who's got the counter hate type of matchup. Okay, Elementals. Here's my rant of the day. Not only do I think Elementals might be the worst matchup for Control right now in the top of the meta, I feel like Elementals is top 3 decks in the format right now, and whatever decks we talk about in the next Road to Vegas episode, one of us needs to cover what Elementals is, because I cannot figure out what's good against it. I just have a hunch here and there. Maybe Hammer and other really fast combo decks can get under Elementals.
Yeah. We said Tron, right?
I come on, Stan, I really thought Control being good was one of the big reasons Elementals was dropping out of favor. Especially these 4-color Yorion Control-ish style decks. I just really thought it was very, very favored for you. Is that not the case?
So maybe Yorion decks are good in this matchup, but my plain old Chalice Control deck, I played against Elementals twice, and I just felt like you have these answers. You have your Supreme Verdicts, you have these sweepers, but you can never win the card advantage game because so many of their creatures draw cards and replace themselves. That and your Prismatic Ending sometime can't reach whatever creatures that they present. So they'll do Grief stuff, and they'll strip your hand a little bit. Then they'll play 4-mana, 4-color Omnath. And that just generates so much value that if you can't answer that with pretty much either Subtlety or Supreme Verdict, it's going to run away with the game. Risen Reef draws them a million cards over the course of the game. That I think, this is just an Elementals is a really interesting deck, that it is both a creature deck that never runs out of gas. And that's just, I think, designed really well to kind of counteract what Control typically does. So unless you can play multiple Supreme Verdicts, sometimes just having a single sweeper isn't enough, and Prismatic Ending might not be able to take care of much of anything in their deck. And you need to fetch for a Rogran Triumph to even deal with the Risen Reef.
With literally anything with Prismatic in this deck, yeah.
So I think Elementals is really good. And the reason why I think it's one of the best decks in the format is because it's both good against, in my opinion, Control, and I think Shane and I would agree that it's really good against Burn, Omnath in particular, that if this one creature deck can deal with both sides of the metagame, the aggro Burn deck and the slow Control deck, that's a great position to be in.
Yeah, it dies. I think it dies hard to Cascade though.
Yeah.
And it has so much creature interaction that if it goes up against a deck like Tron that doesn't have creatures in it, Control maybe aside, it can, people just go over it, and so it loses to those. too. Because if Fury and Solitude aren't good in your matchup, then I think Elementals probably isn't in a great position.
Well, if Fury and Solitude aren't great in your matchup, then Grief is, right? And it's like you run a ton of these, and Omnath is just good in every matchup.
Right.
Okay, Tron, favored for control. Sometimes they'll get liberated and take over the game, but you practically never lose post board because you have all these counter spells, you have Spreading Seas. I feel like Tron is actually kind of easy for control these days.
Different world. That used to be very far the other way. But
what a time to be alive.
Yeah.
Footfalls, I think you're generally favored, not only because they're super vulnerable to counter spells, but you have Teferi on the board, and sometimes that's game over. Chalice on 0 is also really tough to beat. Whereas Living End will have a lot of really good main deck tools against them, I think Footfalls is actually more vulnerable. But I can see Footfalls having really good draws because they too will run Force of Negation sometimes, or can play a Prismatic Ending, or not Prismatic Ending, the new Prismari command to deal with the Chalice sometimes. Or they'll pivot into a beatdown deck with Furies and Brazen Borrowers, and then Blue-Eye Control just plays Solitude and Verdict and wins anyway.
Right.
And then, just for posterity, Mill. I think Mill is actually really favored against Blue-Eye Control. Control is the exact type of strategy that Mill loves to beat up on. They have a ton of hand disruption, they have counter magic, then they just get this engine online and you have no way of recovering your library. And likewise, Yawgmoth, I think Blue-Eye Control is favored in the Yawgmoth matchup. Just because I've often found that Yawgmoth is kind of soft to counter magic and control strategies in general. You have enough removal and graveyard hate that sometimes you can just shut off the Yawgmoth engine entirely.
There you go. All right, so thanks for taking us through the matchups. What do you think the pros are? Why do you think this would be what you would pick for competitive Modern?
Right. So undoubtedly one of the best decks in the format. Maybe the best deck in the format. Beautifully built to cover a lot of bases, right? It's got land hate with Spreading Seas. It has Chalice to shore up like some more degenerate decks. Teferi stops combo decks and is great in the control mirrors. Prismatic Ending, Solitude, and Supreme Verdicts are awesome in a lot of control matchups. And likewise, thanks to these new pickups, it's just as well-rounded as ever. And I think it's one of those decks that exists for a specific time. Blue-Eye Control is not going to look the same a year from now, I bet. And the fact that we have this version of it right now and how consistently successful it's been sort of speaks to, the elegance of its building. That said, despite the power level and the new toys it got, I think it still suffers from some classic control deck problems, right? Being super slow in skill testing. You're not winning games quickly ever. And sometimes you're just trying to win game one and play the clock really aggressively so that you always have a couple minutes on top of your opponent. And likewise, it can lose to itself if you just get the wrong draws in close matchups, like how I felt playing against Burn, where I would just have like Jace, Teferi, and Supreme Verdict in my hand, and they would just blow me out. Mm-hmm. Likewise, because it's so close to the top, I think really good players are just starting to understand how to play against it. And that's why maybe Charbelcher is starting to get an edge, or Amulet might be getting a little bit of an edge. So whether it's Burn Elementals or another deck I lost to, Domain Zoo, being the best deck in the format doesn't always give you the leg up when players start to develop plans to deal with it. And in this format right now, I don't think we get a lot of free wins. Everything is pretty skill testing. So Blue-Eye Control is never a free win deck to begin with, unless you're playing against Tron, I think. And then the sideboard, this is an easy one. It's mostly to shore up close matchups to bring in stronger tech against specific decks, right? Like Sunset Rivalry for Burn, Mystical Dispute for other blue decks, Dovin's Veto, same thing. Sometimes you have an extra threat like Kozilek or Shark Typhoon. As I mentioned, the hardest part for me was understanding what cards to remove from the sideboard, because sometimes you have to cut powerful cards just because they're too slow, including 5-mana Teferi, Jace, or Memory Deluge for that matter. Also, I think it's really important to remember player draw. Like Chalice and Spreading Seas and Archmage's Charm get a little bit worse on the draw in matchups where they're not silver bullets.
Mm-hmm. All right, so what do you think about this? All in.
All in, if Vegas was next week, I would probably ask some people to lend me Solitudes and Chalices, because I think this deck is wonderful, and I would have a lot of fun playing it for 8 rounds.
Boy.
Yeah. Like
that good.
I'm this over Murktide right now.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, because you did love those decks, so interesting to see where your mind is at. Okay. Shane?
All right. I did Hammertime, as we said in the intro, and we've talked a lot about Hammer. People know a lot about Hammer. I'm not really going to focus on the ins and outs of the deck construction. I think it's a known good deck, and I think it almost feels a little bit silly to talk about why this deck is good, but I think that people know why it's good, right? Like, it's consistent, and it has a variety of game plans sort of built in the deck in itself, and can be aggressive and can grind. So it has a lot of different factors and facets to it that make it appealing to a lot of players, because it can win out of nowhere, or if you know how to get edges in longer games, you can really just win on turn 12 or win on turn 2. And not a lot of decks can say they can do that sort of thing. That was the sort of thing that I think Infect pilots liked being able to do maybe a while ago. It's not necessarily win on turn 12, but you could win a longer game if you knew how to get the small edges and just play better than your opponent. I think that just out of the gate, I think that it's being hated on enough right now that it's not the tier 0 that it might have felt like. And so I think its current place in the meta is known good tier 1 deck. We see that the deck counts indicate that. The experiences I've had playing the deck recently, I think, kind of gets at maybe some of the hate that it's seeing. But people are still playing it. People are still winning with it. And it is still evolving slightly with some new additions and consistently playing stuff like Orzhov for extra mana for things like Prismatic Ending and for things like Thoughtseize in the sideboard.
There's lots of hammer decks, though. They're all over the place still. It's all over the place. The thing that really pushed this deck into top tier contention was Urza Saga, though, and it turned the deck from kind of a lark, kind of a funny combo deck, into a real tier 1, and sometimes maybe even tier 0 deck that gives this deck a way to generate creatures, and creatures that are substantial because of the artifact synergies in the deck, without requiring cards out of your hand. And it's also a tutor for Colossus Hammer after it goes through stage 3, chapter 3 rather, and then you can tutor up a Colossus Hammer or other tech pieces that you can play. Things like Pithing Needle, or maybe a piece of Graveyard Hate like a Soul Guide Lantern or a Nihil Spellbomb, or if there's creatures on the other side and you need to get through them, you can get your Shadow Spear that provides life gain and trample. And so there's a lot of just valuable things that you can get out of your deck with Urza Saga. And so that made it more reliable, more diverse, more grindy, all the things that you want out of a deck like this. And so Hammer really exists as the deck that punishes slow decks that aren't interacting well early, but can also outgrind decks that have some removal, because you have Urza Saga, you have Luris. You can just turn a single top deck into lethal damage. And not a lot of decks can do that. Just a single top deck just can be game over. And I can't think of many decks that can do that. Just kind of out of nowhere say, hey, I'm hitting you for 10 more than you thought I was. Right.
Or I'm equipping this, you thought you had me dead to rights. I drew this. I then cast it out of my hand with flash speed, and you're dead. So Dave, you also played an Urza Saga deck, and you wanted to talk about it a little bit here, and I think it makes sense to talk about your experiences playing Urza Saga. Like, why is it good? Why is it hard to use? Like, what is it? What do you think it's bringing to Jund, and what did you feel like playing with the card?
Well, I mean, so for me, it's interesting how different it is between Jund and this deck, right? I think in Jund you had to really think about, when can I afford to play a colorless generating land. And like I said, a lot of times it has to do with you having Tarmogoyf in your hand so that you can use that as your play. The other thing is that, you always have to keep in mind that you can't play Urza Saga on turn 1, because then you don't get the tap trigger out of it. You don't get to be able to make 2 constructs, and that's really what you want to do. Although sometimes you're looking at yourself in that deck and you're like, well, my line really here is just to try to use all this mana and get Shadow Spear and not worry about it. I think there's lots of different angles like that. I think with your deck, you're probably always trying to go the construct route, right? Like, you're probably just kind of going for it. And then, of course, the other thing is your mana is easier to work with than mine is. But
yeah, I felt those exact same pressures, honestly, because it depends on the matchup. Where against a deck where I need to outrun the removal, then yeah, I'm kind of trying to lean on the construct end of things, where it's like, hey, I'm going to make a 4/4 maybe a 5/5 creature that you can't ignore. And you're going to have to spend a piece of cardboard on this, or pressure you enough that you have to cast a Wrath, where I can then deploy stuff that's in my hand. And so sometimes you can play the game where you're just getting free things out of your lands and not worrying about casting stuff out of your hand. But sometimes you do feel that pressure where it's like, this land is a grenade that's going to go off. And I need to know what I'm doing on every turn with the mana I have available, because everything is a game of inches with Hammer, where it's like, do I cast a 1-drop, and then do I use the Springleaf Drum to cast out this spell? Or it's like, what can I do? I use the 2 mana to make a construct, or do I deploy this Stoneforge Mystic to like get a piece of equipment in my hand? And so it's all about trying to balance, what threats do I want to present? And then sometimes you just want to have a piece of mana, and it's one of your lands in your deck that you drew, and you have to figure out how do you get around the fact that it's colorless and you are going to lose it. And sometimes that just sucks. And sometimes you're just like, well, I basically played a Wastes that became a Springleaf Drum because I still needed the mana. And that's not great.
It's still a better out than what happened in Jund sometimes, where you can't even run. I mean, there's no reason to run Springleaf Drum in Jund, you know what I mean? Where you can make a lot of use out of it, and in this deck you can't. So, yeah, I think it's interesting to see him in these two different decks and see, other places it pops up.
It's really hard to, I think, use perfectly, because you have to really know what you're doing in the matchup, right? And I think sometimes it's easy, where it's like, I am playing against blue-white control, and therefore I'm not going to play stuff out of my hand because I want to make them cast the cardboard. And maybe something against like Jund or a pile of removal, where it's like, I just want them to spend spells on my land, right? And then I can maybe try to recover, getting higher value out of their deck, while they're hoping to top deck Fatal Pushes or Prismatic Endings or something like that. And so you have to think about the long game. And that's one way this deck does enable the long game, is not only that it is always tutoring up hammers if you want them, but it's just always creating threats if you want them. And that's really valuable. But let's get back to the deck really fast. And so I think that the primary points of contention in this deck in terms of the construction is there's a few flex spots. Like, are you running Ingenious Smith? Are you running Giver of Runes? Are you maybe running Sanctifier on Vec main? Are you going to get really rogue and run like maybe a couple Core Outfitter because you want those extra equippers, which are kind of one of the bottlenecks of the deck? And then also what the artifact package looks like. Are you running a main deck piece of like cycling Yard Hate, like a Nihil Spellbomb or a Soul Guide Lantern? Are you maybe running an extra piece of beatdown equipment like Cranial Plating? Are you maybe running a few Mishra's Bauble for Luris value, and just to kind of make your deck a little bit more lean and have free artifacts to enable your Pure Steel Paladin? But I think largely the deck feels pretty solved, and I'm almost comfortable saying the flex spots don't matter that much, because people seem to win with whatever configuration they're using. I do have some tame opinions on what sort of feels better, or I think is better right now, based on the metagame that we're seeing. But let's quickly run through the matchups. And I'm just going to talk about good matchups, and I'll talk about bad matchups.
Sounds good.
And so the good matchups are, I think, anything that's screwing around and not interacting with you. So you can usually race things like Tron. You can usually race things like Amulet Titan. And there's probably a good reason that these decks are not tier 1 anymore, or perhaps even tier 2 that often, because Hammer is just so popular and it can punish decks like these. And I think that Hammer can also punish decks that are interacting with you, but they're doing it in a proactive way. Like, you've heard my complaints about Grief Ephemerate many times, right? Or Orzhov Stoneblade style decks where they do pick your hand apart a little bit, but this deck is so good at being redundant and so good at drawing into what you want, or eventually getting what you want with like Urza Saga. And so these decks typically aren't presenting a good enough clock that you care about. So it's like, okay, maybe you're getting your grief on turn 3, but I don't care. Like, it's just not enough to stop what Hammer is doing. And that's a huge pro of Hammer, is that it's just so reliable. If it's given enough time. And so I think that's something that a lot of other decks can't always offer. I think that's why the good combo decks are good right now. Things like Living End, things like Cascade, is like they're just going to get the piece that they need. And I think the same is true for Hammer in a lot of ways. I think this punishes any bad control deck. Like there's people are still playing like an Esper control or something like that. Like it's just no, you're not going to beat this deck because you don't run the pieces that you need, like Solitude, or maybe like if you're not running Chalice on one or something like that. I think you're just, or a sweeper even, or maybe you have like 2 sweepers and your white mana is really bad. It's just if you aren't running like Azorius control that's tuned for the meta, then this is the kind of deck that's going to run you over. I think that this beats Burn pretty well. And I think that you're just making threats that Burn can't deal with pretty quickly. Like if you're playing it smart and they don't have enough burn that hits your creatures, or if you're playing in a way that doesn't let their burn hit your creatures, then you eventually just get stuff that they can't kill, and then you put a Shadow Spear on it, and the game's over. And then you have Onvec in the side to make it even tougher for them.
Right.
I think Murktide is pretty favored for you generally. I think the downtick in this deck is one of the reasons that I think Hammer has been getting less good in the meta right now. Is that Murktide is kind of fading.
Okay, so what's a bad matchup look like for this deck?
I think there's more of them than you might think in right now. I think the worst matchups are stuff that interacts with you that also presents a clock. And this is Modern in 2021, and there's quite a few decks that do things like this. I think Elementals is kind of on the fence, whether it's a good or bad matchup. They have a lot of ways to interact with you, and then they can turn the corner really hard, but I think you can get under it, unless they have like a Solitude draw. Like if you're putting in big damage on turn 2 or turn 3, then that can be pretty good for you. But I think that there's a lot of ways for them to get an edge on you. Like if they're casting a Fury, like you have a hard time, I think, out grinding Elementals. So like you're really hoping to out aggro them. And then if you do get sideboard pieces like Void Mirror potentially, or like Hushbringer potentially, then you're going to slow them down enough that I think you can win. But I think it's pretty reliant on you getting those sideboard pieces, games 2 and game 3. I think Jund is pretty bad for you, perhaps really bad for you, especially like classic Jund. Like if you're still going to see a random classic Jund deck, like you are in for a bad time, my friend, because like they just have lots of ways to get your stuff off the board. And then the Kolaghan's Command and just all that kind of stuff is really bad. I think Footfalls can be challenging because I think that they have also begun teching more against small creature strategies. Like they have Force of Negation for your hammers or your Sigarda's Aid or any spell that kind of matters. They have playsets of Fury. They have main deck Prismari commands. They have just ways to interact with your deck and what it's trying to do. And so you're going to do things like try to bring in Drannith Magistrate to do some work against the Cascade decks, but those can't, it can be hit with evoke creatures still. So I also will bring in Thoughtseize against these decks to strip out Cascaders, maybe strip out elemental threats before they're able to evoke them. So I think that's kind of what you need to do against decks like these, is sort of treat them like control decks, because they are going to be the control in the matchup. And against all these kind of decks is, if they have interaction, shave your acceleration, because you're far more apt to have to grind than you are to kill them on turn 2. You're not going to get under Jund on turn 2. They're going to kill your initial threat, and then you're going to top deck a Springleaf Drum on like turn 8, and you're going to be like, why do I have this in my deck? So just think about like how the game's actually going to go, and it's not going to go in the way of you killing them on turn 2, like very often, if ever. And because interaction is more popular right now, I think, and I think we see it in the stats, it's one reason I think Giver of Runes is the flex creature of choice right now over Ingenious Smith, because like I don't really need more ways to get hammers in my hand. I'm usually having enough of those. I think that I want to be able to protect my creatures, one, against removal and against evoke style creatures, but also I've won more than a few games by just a timely protection against a creature on the other side.
Right. Get by a blocker.
Exactly.
Do you feel like you're getting better with this deck? Because
You don't.
you've been playing with it for a long time now.
On and off, yeah.
I don't think I'm getting better with it. No, in fact, the play sessions I had with this deck, I maybe played like 12 matches or so. I felt like I was playing worse with it, or maybe just having worse luck. There were definitely some games where it's like, sweet, I outground the opponent, I made some good decisions, or like I used Giver of Runes like a really clever way to get through something. But largely, I didn't feel great with the deck. Why do you ask?
Because you've been playing with it for a while. We're thinking about the format really critically lately.
At different points in the meta. Yeah.
You're planning to room with me and play footsie in Vegas.
Yeah, man, I don't know. I'll tell you more about my overall thoughts about the deck in a minute. But no, I think the answer is I do not feel like I'm getting better with the deck.
Cool.
And I think it's because it's a different Modern than it was 2 months ago.
Yeah.
For sure. And I need to learn what the meta is. I also think this deck is bad against good control decks. Like, I think Azorius control, like we talked about this. It's got Chalice, it's got Sweepers, it's got Prismatic Ending, it has Bounce Planeswalkers, which I hate. It's just pretty brutal to face down. I will, again, try to bring in Thoughtseize to try to get the higher CMC value cards out of their hand. Sometimes they might just have a single piece of early removal. Sometimes they might just have a single Solitude that they're really leaning on hard. And Thoughtseize is as good as always to get the cards you don't want to see out of your opponent's hand. And then Mill is a really bad matchup. As we've talked about, Tasha's Hideous Laughter can just mill half your deck. But I have had wins against the deck. Like, I think unless they cast Tasha's, like, you have a very good chance just to kill them because they might need 5 turns. And so if you are playing Mill, just mulligan for Tasha's.
Whether it's Mill or just kind of the nature of Hammer in general, there are certain matchups where you have to put yourself into a position where you win seemingly out of nowhere, where it's like you're thinking several turns ahead so you can get in that point where you have, a flying infect land that you attach a hammer to, or is it kind of like you are always positioning yourself to grind and hope that sometimes in your grind you find like that out that maybe no one expected?
I think more often than not when you're playing this deck, you are playing it as maximizing top decks is one thing. Like, if you don't have it in your hand, you have to put yourself in a position to win if you top deck it. Because if you didn't cast something, like, let's say, for example, you're like, this happens all the time, where it's like, when do I play my 0 drops? Do I expose them to removal? Or do I sandbag them and try to surprise my opponent by enabling Metalcraft or something like that, right? And I think more often than not, you're going to win more games by having more creatures out to attach hammers to or something like that, right? Like, I think you have to think about what's happening on the next few turns. And if you didn't cast a 0 drop and then you can't swing with it, what was the point type thing? Like, I think playing scared is not how this deck wins. I think playing to your outs is going to be better longer term, depending on the matchup, of course. But I think that's the way I kind of thought about the deck more often, is like, it's a game of it's very mana starved because of Urza Saga and because you sometimes want to be able to win with Inkmoth Nexus, right? And so it just feels like a deck where it's like every decision in terms of your casting matters a lot, and that's just kind of Modern in general, right? But I think you often make 2 decisions more than maybe Control deck does, where it's like, I'm going to cast 1 mana spell, 2 mana spell, 3 mana spell, and they're all going to be really good. Hammer is about, how do I maximize all these 0, 1, and 2 mana spells and at the right time so that I don't mess up and let myself get blown out by a Fatal Push or something like that.
Sure.
So overall, I think the deck still feels solid to me, but it doesn't feel broken. In a way that I think it might have back when people were still figuring out the format and like playing slightly slower decks or slightly less tuned decks or decks that didn't have the right interaction or the right elemental spells or weren't respecting Fury enough or weren't respecting Solitude enough or playing like 2 Force of Negation instead of 4 in their main decks. And I think that all these decks have begun to realize that they're better off doing these things. And I think that it has hurt Hammer in some way. But I think Hammer still does what it does really reliably. It has turn 2, it has turn 3 kills. It punishes things that are a little bit too slow. It punishes things that are, that just open themselves up, like one wrong attack. Like it punishes playing against worse players, or a player who makes one wrong decision and doesn't realize that this attack makes them exposed to a hammer on the crackback or something like that, right? Where it's just like, or, oh, I didn't count the artifacts correctly, and now this construct has enough power to kill me, or something like that, right? Just stuff like that happens, and you can take advantage of it. It's not going to happen at day 2 of a GP, but it'll happen in some leagues. Mm-hmm. I do think that it's slightly not solid because of the hate right now. Like I was saying, like I just feel like there's Saga hate, there's Graveyard hate, there's Artifact hate, there's Enchantment hate, there's Force of Vigors everywhere. There's still Wear Tears out there. Interactive decks are on the rise right now, I feel like, and I just really feel like this deck doesn't want to see a lot of interaction. I think that's why I would play Giver of Runes rather than another flex spot, just because of you need to be able to protect your stuff against removal, or else you're not going to get the damage through. So I ended up feeling like less impressed than I remember being with Hammer, but it's not like I think it's bad. I just think people are prepared, and I think the meta is different than it was 2 months ago. And I did fine in my testing, but I didn't feel like anything I was doing was like broken. And so like it sort of feels like a creature combo deck in like a world of interactive decks, or free counter magic decks, or exile effect, removal. And it's all this kind of stuff that just feels like, it's a meta that adjusts and players that adjust. So I don't think that anyone would claim that like Hammer is broken at this point, but I think that you can really do well with it, and you can definitely win a lot of games with it. And it's fun. I think it's a fun deck to play. So yeah, I'm fine with it. Like, I probably would practice with it more and see how I like it over like the next 2 weeks, and then make a decision if it's like the deck. I mean, we have to lock down right within like 2 weeks, right? So we can have real legitimate practice. So it's definitely on my short list.
Practice. This is
on my
us,
short list.
This is us not only practicing the decks we play with, but practicing against the decks we're going to see, so that even if we're not going to play Amulet, at least we'll know how to beat Amulet because of who beats us.
All right, so let's close this one out. But before we do that, what's your 2-deck short list right now? Mine is Burn and Hammer. Those are the decks I think are very good and efficient.
So for the main event, which I think is an important distinction, it's blue white and Footfalls.
Yeah. I think for me it's Murktide and Jund.
Wow. Mm-hmm. No two answers are alike.
No. But you guys have been playing a lot more than me lately. Like this is the first time I've gotten to get in the queues in 3 weeks or so, 2 weeks. So, recency bias.
I had mentioned that I felt like someone needs to play Elementals next. Do you guys have those feelings about any decks? Like, this is what we have to play ASAP.
I think we should keep that a secret for the next episode, because I feel like we might roll right into another one of these next. We're going to have to do the rogue possibilities at some point. We're going to have to do whatever the next tier is. Let's see how things keep evolving.
Spicy. Dave, did you watch Dune? Because the spice must flow.
Oh, yeah.
That's out before this episode drops.
I will be watching that for sure.
Well, that wraps up this week's episode and Dune Hype podcast. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or just reach out in general, you can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com, or submit an audio question via podinbox.com/thedivedown. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/thedivedown. Gets you into our Discord server, gets you more perks. Dave is designing deck boxes, so finally you can store your cards somewhere safe instead of holding them together with a rubber band. Not sure why we still do that in this day and age where we have so many cool deck boxes. I guess we're just waiting for Dave to design one.
And where do you keep your beads if you don't have a deck box?
I keep them in a velvet bag.
Oh, thank you.
Like a scholar.
Velvet bag. Like one of those little Crown Royale bags.
Yeah, actually, yes.
Yeah. Shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring The Dive Down. Sign up for Mana Traders with promo code The Dive Down 2021. You'll get 15% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. Get better at Magic while you support our show. That's what we're talking about every day on The Dive Down. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. Until next week, hey, thanks for listening, and play more Magic.
We have 2 new reviews this week from The Roast Doctor and Ion Don Pod Fan. 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 Ion Don Pod Fan.